You'll never do right, nor God will never prosper you until you give him his due, the king his due, that is my successors, and the people their due. And he even says, I'm as much for them as any of you.
Hello and welcome to this bonus and extra episode of the Aspects of History podcast. I'm continuing my chat with Mark Turnbull on the execution of Charles I. So if you've not heard part 1, which was on the trial, I recommend you go back and listen to that. The execution of Charles I was the only time we've chopped off the head of our king. Now, if you ask me, I actually think it was a good thing ultimately, because it reminded the monarchy that they rule only by consent. So any tyrannical leanings that Charles III might have, well, he just has to look at what happened to his namesake. But with that said, Charles I received his sentence with dignity and nobility. We all know that he wore 2 shirts on that cold January morning so as not to shiver and look afraid. But with Mark Turnbull, we dig a bit deeper and learn what happened in the lead up to the chop, the execution itself, as well as its legacy through history. Coming up, I've got Saul David on the Zulu War, Gary Sheffield on the First World War, John Sayles on 18th century Scotland and America, and Tom Petch on the SAS. Please do subscribe if you can, and if you can rate or review, I'd be very grateful. I do hope you enjoy my chat with Mark Turnbull on the execution of Charles I. So, Mark, welcome back to the podcast. This is our 2-parter on the trial and the execution of Charles I, which took place in January 1649. So we are at the anniversary. And I wanted to, for listeners who've not heard the first part, I do recommend you go back and listen to that, because it deals with the background behind how Charles was brought to trial, and it describes that we talk about the trial itself and Charles's behavior in it, Cromwell's behavior in it. And we've reached the end of the trial. The court refuses to hear Charles, and they establish that he is guilty of treason. So we're going to pick things up now. We're in the aftermath. The guilty verdict has been given. What happens next?
Yeah, so behind the scenes, the guilty verdict's given. Now it's a case of the punishment, and the commissioners that are handpicked to try Charles. There is nearly half of them don't turn up, and that list is headed by General Fairfax, who completely disassociates himself from the court. And one famous anecdote is obviously his wife in the public gallery. When his name's called out, she says he's got more wit than to be here. So you've got only half of the commissioners present, really. It varies very slightly day to day. The death warrant, when it's being signed and when they're looking to proceed to execution, it's at that moment behind the scenes that I wish I was a fly in the wall, because there must have been so many discussions, debates, arguments, going on. And amongst it all, there's this really visual anecdote of Cromwell and Henry Martin. And Henry Martin is an absolute Republican. He can't stand Charles. That stems back decades. Charles had once called him a whoremaster, and asked him to get out of the same area that he was in, because Henry Martin was a bit of a womanizer and drinker. And so Cromwell and Martin are joking together. They're flicking ink at each other as the signing of the death warrant goes on. And
they're flicking ink?
Yeah. So,
as in for fun?
Yeah, for fun, just flicking ink at each other, laughing, carrying on, which it is such a strange thing to happen at that pivotal point in proceedings. I mean, I've heard it suggested that Cromwell was just anxious, but But, as a politically savvy leader, an intelligent man who knew when to associate himself and when not, I don't know. It's a bit strong to suggest that he was just anxious for my part. I think perhaps relief. I think this must have been a very tense and stressful moment for everybody involved, the king, the prosecution, Bradshaw, Cromwell. Perhaps it was relief that they'd got to this point now, and that signatures were being applied to the death warrant. A hope that the end was in sight, they would remove the king. But yeah, I mean, if we turn the tables and say that Charles flicked ink at somebody when he was signing the death warrant of one of his enemies during his personal rule, I'm sure nobody would perhaps suggest that it was Charles's anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're not buying that at all. I see that too. I mean, Cromwell does not strike me as we've had Miranda Mallins talking about Cromwell and Paul Lay talking about the Cromwell. Now, the Cromwell they describe, the Cromwell they write about is not one that to me would be anxious. He always seems to know exactly what he wanted to do. Listeners may be familiar with the film Cromwell, starring Richard Harris as Oliver Cromwell, and in that in the scene where the death warrant is signed, Cromwell is effectively going around, not forcing people to sign, but he's telling them you will sign. Well, I guess it is forcing.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt.
Do you think there's truth in that?
I think there's truth that he mustered waivers. Yeah, whether or not that involved forcibly signing, whether it involved an altercation or not, I don't think anyone will know, because there'll be no record of that. But yes, I think if it wasn't for his strength of character, seeing it through, and maybe because Cromwell at the end of the day at that point firmly believed this was God's will. So for Cromwell, he is God's instrument at seeing this through, and he'll have no stock for waverers in that regard. Again, Fairfax is not there. People look to him for leadership.
Was that a mistake? Do you think Fairfax removing himself? I mean, I guess for his own safety's sake, it was wise. But had he been there, do you think the death warrants would have been signed? Yeah,
because I think you can see even when Fairfax was appointed as general that he wasn't as strong a character as Cromwell, and a lot of the actions that led up to the trial and the execution itself, Fairfax was against them. He was against the purge, but eventually he had to give way. He was in almost as impossible a situation as the king. When we talk about plead or not, Fairfax could either be involved or not. But really, whatever way he went, the outcome wouldn't change, I think. And I think he knew that. And if he retained his position, attended, and then objected publicly, that could bring about a rupture in the army and the commissioners, which could cause another war. And I think for Fairfax, that took precedence over the king's life, that and perhaps over his own life as well. I think he thought, as general, I'll have to just absent myself, which would then give the message that I'm not in agreement, but it allows everything to proceed. He's not going to be a blocker or an obstacle.
And so because I think that the guilty verdict's 27th of January, so the court had lasted a week, from the 20th to the 27th. When are the death warrants signed? What date are they signed? And when is that publicized so that the people are aware that their king is going to have his head chopped off?
Yeah, so there is a lot of debate about when the warrant was signed, because I've read blogs and information by I think it was one of the keepers of the warrant in the archives, that when they've examined the writing and the parchment itself, it's got some amendments, so it suggests that perhaps it was signed by some of the commissioners and then it was passed to the rest. So was there was there a rupture there? Was there a need to get people back on? Or was it just literally they wanted to authorize by getting the leaders signed and sealed, and then they could pass it to others that weren't perhaps present? Yeah, so a bit of a tricky one to know precisely when it was signed. It seems to be over a period of a couple of days. And then as for the people finding out, I mean, it all moved very, very quickly. I'm not sure that any actual formal notification was given. I think obviously people knew that he'd been found guilty and that the penalty had been given in the court. So I think it was clear that it was going to happen, but nobody expected it to happen so quick. You've got even the Dutch are sending over ambassadors to Parliament to negotiate for a reprieve, just for a temporary respite so that they can negotiate. And everybody around is shocked when the final moment happens. The royal family is shocked. Some of Charles's leading supporters are utterly devastated to find out that it's actually happened, and it's happened so quick. And I think Parliament know, or those commissioners in the rump, they know if they do not proceed quickly, then the longer it goes on, the longer unrest builds, the longer that shock will wear off, that inertia. Other foreign heads of state will be more interested in rescue attempts.
It is a hugely shocking event, really, when one thinks about it. Even 300 odd years later, 350 odd years later, it seems like a shocking event. When the scaffold is being constructed and preparations are being made, the execution takes place in Whitehall, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. So just outside of Whitehall Palace, so the banqueting house itself, there's a scaffold built adjoining that.
And do they start building that during the trial, or are they?
No, I think that was built after the sentence was passed.
Okay, so they knock that up pretty quickly, within a few days. But the crowd and the execution is a very moving moment. And Charles, again, as I mentioned right at the beginning of part one, where this really was Charles's finest hour, the trial and execution. And in the execution itself, could you just describe the moments before he comes out onto the scaffolding, and also the crowd themselves, because they weren't baying for blood, were they?
No, so the crowd themselves are held back. So, I mean, it's very unlikely that the crowd could see much or hear much. They were held back from the scaffold by soldiers, by cavalry. The area around Whitehall and that banqueting house was enclosed. It had to gates at either end as well. So very limited. The authorities made sure that shops remained open. They wanted as less fuss as possible, just more distractions. As I say, a post was stopped, streets were plugged with soldiers. Fairfax himself couldn't even move around London to get to Parliament to intervene on that day. So he was attempting to get to MPs. His own army, they were blocking the streets, which to me suggests, it hints at least at a coup. It hints at least that Cromwell and the other army leaders were aware that Fairfax had some plan to intervene. And whatever happened, the Dutch ambassadors that went with Fairfax just noted that they were unable to get to Parliament. Now, if you've got your general with some Dutch ambassadors trying to get to the Houses of Parliament to discuss with MPs, for his own troops to block that, it has to be more than just, I couldn't actually shimmy past the 100 men that were stationed in that street. I couldn't actually get there. There was a traffic jam. It's not that. This seems to be some sort of deliberate act to stop Fairfax from following through.
And there was a very real concern that Charles could be sprung, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think there was.
Henrietta Maria in Leander de Lisle's new book describes Henrietta Maria originally receiving a message that he had escaped.
Yeah, I think that rumours and different things. Yeah, I think Charles knew that an escape would be nigh and impossible, given the security.
Yeah, what you just described.
Yeah. So I think on the inside he could see that. On the outside, that there would always be that hope. Surely somebody will not let this happen. Somebody will act.
And so we get to the moment where he is called to be executed. What are his last moments like?
So quite a tense time for Charles. So he's escorted. He gets up.
He's not cracking jokes.
No, absolutely not. But again, behaves impeccably with decorum, courageous. Let's face it, he behaved very courageously. Walks from St. James's Palace under guard. He's got by some accounts a man running up alongside him, staring at him, trying to intimidate him. The bishop sees him off. He gets to Whitehall Palace, and at that point he's then left. So he spends around 4 hours in a room with Bishop Juxon and Herbert, the attendant that Parliament had assigned him for a little while. He was his sole attendant before Juxon. He spends hours waiting to find out what's happened. He's praying, he's meditating. It gets to the point where Juxon says, Your Majesty, you must eat something, otherwise there's a chance that you could end up fainting through hunger, especially with the cold. And Charles reluctantly agrees to take some bread and wine. Yeah, so he agreed to take just a little bit of bread, some wine, just to fortify himself. And it's during that 4 hours, that hiatus in events, where Charles must have been sitting in this room, desperately trying to keep it together, when Fairfax is attempting to get to MPs. It's potentially when MPs are debating, what are we going to do to make sure that the proclamation of a new king doesn't occur around the kingdom? Messengers are dispatched to the various compass points, to warn people, do not proclaim any new.
And that's interesting, because as we've seen with the death of Elizabeth II, it's a procedure that is well known to, as you say, all the points of the kingdom. That's just what happens. It's like a moving machine that just starts the moment the monarch the sovereign dies.
That's right, yeah. And they might vote that that's now illegal, but I think in practice, they need to ensure that doesn't happen. So, you've got all of this going on. And in the end, when someone finally does knock on the door, you've got Juxon and Herbert fall to their knees. They're crying. Charles can't cope with this. The night before the execution, he's seen his children 2 days before.
His youngest too.
Yeah, he's seen.
We should mention that Charles, his elder children, in particular Charles, the Prince of Wales, is in Paris.
That's right. Yeah. So the children he meets is Henry and Elizabeth. So Henry is the second youngest. He meets them and takes his leave of them. It's an extremely emotional scene. Elizabeth records this. She doesn't forget it. Elizabeth 13, Henry's 8. They come into the room. Charles ends up comforting Elizabeth. She can't. She's unable to hold back her tears. He tries to talk to them to just reinforce a few things. He wants them to to get a message back to Henrietta to say that his thoughts had never strayed from her. The love is the same to the last. He's instructing the two children to forgive his enemies as he has done. For Henry, he takes him on his knee and says, don't be made a king by them while your brothers do live. Henry says he'll be torn to pieces first, which satisfies Charles. And Elizabeth throughout this is sobbing.
So there's a concern that Henry might become a puppet monarch.
Yeah, and that was, it had been touted even during Charles's captivity by some people, that perhaps just set Henry up. He could be moulded and displace Charles. And Charles is telling him, look, it's a glorious death that I'm going to die. It's for the laws and liberties of the land and for maintaining the Protestant religion. So he's getting these messages across. At that point, they go to leave, and daughter can't take. She bursts into tears. They run back. They embrace again. And as they are ushered out, that moment becomes too much, and Charles collapses. He's taken to his bed. He can't stand, his knees have gone. And I think at that point, that's when Charles realizes that he must bounce back from this moment if he is going to face his end with dignity. And in view of this moment with his children and the effect it had on him, Charles takes an orange studded with cloves in his pocket that morning. So just in case he needs the assistance of a sharp scent. So I think this is how much Charles understood the criticality of his final moments, and how much he wanted to make sure that went according to his plan. And the double shirt, so wearing two shirts so that he didn't appear to shiver.
This is the thing that he is most well known for in the execution. He doesn't want to shiver, obviously, because it's a January day, it's cold. He doesn't want the shivers to be confused as fear.
Yes, yeah, that's it. He knows that anything like that could be misconstrued. So it has to be an impeccable performance. It's another mask. He's in a court mask again, making sure his performance is impeccable.
And so, as you've mentioned, the crowd coming to watch the execution are not actually that close up, are they, to the events?
No.
And so, how is he? Is it an axe? Is it a sword?
Yeah, so it's an axe.
What's the actual mechanics of? I mean, it's the most gruesome way to go, I suppose. But what are the mechanics of how the execution actually happened?
So it's an axe. It's your typical executioner axe. So very big. If it's wielded correctly, it should be a short, sharp end. I mean, his grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots, had a terrible time of it. Hacking away.
Is this because that some of her hair got in the way and caused trouble?
Yeah, and I think when they lifted the head up at the end, she had a wig, and then the head dropped because the wig, detached.
Dear, oh dear,
I've read that before
stuff.
about. Yeah. So I mean, for Charles, the moment he enters the scaffold, one of the things that he makes a beeline for is the axe. He wants to make sure that it looks in good shape, that nobody's going to interfere with it. He's making speeches from the scaffold, and he keeps turning around to the axe and saying, "Hurt not the axe that might hurt me." Gruesome sight, the staples in the floorboards to hold him down, pin him down if he should struggle. The block itself is extremely small, so it means that he'll have to lie down flat.
So he's not on his knees; he's lying down flat
flat,
crucifix position.
Yeah. So nobody can see the blow. The gruesome sight of it isn't going to generate a rush of sympathy. People can't see the act. If they could, perhaps, that would be an image that would stick with people for so long. They would think, gosh, didn't he behave so admirably and so courageously? Well, they can't see how he's behaving. He's out of sight. And he knows that, and that's why he does speak to a lot of people around the scaffold to make sure that his words are taken back. There's people making notes.
What are his final words? Is there anything of particular note that he says?
Yeah, so he does make reference to the Earl of Strafford, which was his principal minister back in early 1640s. Strafford's executed in 41. And Charles forever blames himself. So Charles eventually signs his death warrant because there's crowds marauding around the palace, threatening his safety, his family's safety. He can't get anything through government because his opponents are blocking everything for Strafford's life. He signs the warrant. Strafford's executed. He makes reference on the scaffold, saying, one unjust sentence that I put forward is now getting repaid on me. He says again that he didn't start the war, that he is defending the church and the government and people's liberties. And he asks people to forgive his enemies again, just as he's done with his children. He makes that clear. He even gives a little bit of advice to the new regime, as it were, in terms of, you'll never do right, nor God will never prosper you until you give him his due, the king his due, that is my successors, and the people their due. And he even says, I'm as much for them as any of you. So that's him continuing that theme from the trial, that he's standing for the people's liberties. He then just clarifies that he dies a Protestant, to head off any rumours there. He reminds people he did not have to be on the scaffold being put to death. He says if he'd submitted to an arbitrary way where the laws were changed according to the power of the sword, there was no need for his death. But that's what he's saying. He isn't going to betray those principles. He isn't going to betray God. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things, he says, which, again, in his opinion, what Leveller demands is preposterous. The common man or woman shouldn't have a say in government. It's not their place.
The divine right of kings, but that was foremost in his mind.
Yeah. But we see Fairfax, Cromwell and Ireton, though, at Putney debates, saying the same thing, that it would be anarchy to have the common man, or they didn't say a woman, but the common man at that point, what the Levellers were pushing, Cromwell says that would be anarchy. You can't just have a vote in government because you breathe. You have to have some sort of holding in the kingdom.
And so Charles really wants to go out a martyr, ultimately.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's successful in that, at the very least, for his descendants. I mean, after this, all monarchs are keen to ensure that, well, certainly they don't end up like Charles, but it's a hugely powerful moment for the royal family.
Absolutely. And I think, back when he was in captivity, what he was willing to negotiate away always had that clause that his powers, or the monarch's powers, would be re-established when handed to his son. So again, it was almost like he was becoming a pariah. He was becoming a blocker to the peace of the kingdom. Perhaps he realized that himself. For whatever reason, he's not going to think that he's to blame, but he's going to think, for whatever reason, I've done something that's got me to this point. If I can just protect those powers and hand them on to Charles, then job well done. That's as much as I can hope for at this point. And you're right, it was an ultimate success.
And so when the news that he's had his head chopped off reaches, do we know Charles II? Do we know, because from that moment he becomes Charles II, even if he's not crowned for another 11 years.
Yeah.
What does Charles? What's the reaction of Charles to learning of his father's death?
So that there's absolute shock across the board. So Charles wrote to the Queen Regent of France of a horrid and deadly blow. King Charles I's close friend from younger years wrote that it was a sadder spectacle than ever we thought would grow out of it. James, so Charles's second son, James, Duke of York, he said what impression that made both upon the Queen and himself may be more easily imagined than expressed. And the Queen just couldn't speak. She was struck silent for a long time. And Edward Hyde said it was an unspeakable and fatal loss. Everybody in exile were so depressed under the heavy weight of affliction that they've scarce recovered motion or breath.
It's powerful stuff. And how about the people? Is there any evidence that there was displeasure with what happened?
There is, yeah. So I mean, some clergymen wrote little entries in their parish records, for example, after the event, and perhaps pre-restoration, just saying this is the anniversary of the murder of the king, that sort of thing, kind of keeping that sort of writing for posterity in a way. But you've got the army then parading through London after the execution, telling people, if you disagree with the execution or if you make your views known, you will forfeit your own life as well. So there was a clear message that there's no protest here. You either shut up or you face justice.
Understood. Right. So then we're in the aftermath of the death of the king. We then enter the interregnum, don't we?
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know, for those men who signed the death warrant, and I think that's a good way to conclude it, really. And then we can talk a little bit actually about the legacy. But for those men who signed the death warrant, what happened to them?
Yeah, so the men that signed the death warrant, a lot of them that actually signed the warrant were leaders, people of influence that in the trial, that were invested in the trial and execution. A lot of them went on to become principal actors in what followed. They went on to become members of the Council of State. So what followed was a faceless group of those leaders took executive power, really. I mean, they had a lot of power. The rump parliament and the MPs, they weren't left with that much power. It was all handled by this executive group. And then over the years that followed, I mean, gradually there was some members of the group that fractured away. Cromwell's fallen out with different people like Lord Grey of Groby, who was instrumental in getting the trial passed through Parliament. In the end, the people that signed the warrant, anyone that was alive at the Restoration, were told that they were exempt from the Act of Oblivion because the regicides, as they called them, Charles II couldn't really spare them. As much as we think, yeah, that's terrible, that he executed them. When you think about it, he's returned to the throne, passed an Act of Oblivion, but what he's saying is, my father was executed. I cannot, as a king who wishes to maintain some sort of dignity and power, pardon everybody. Somebody has to pay the price.
You can't go, let's forgive and forget.
It's
effectively because his position is that his father's been murdered.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the other aspect of this is, so anyone that did die before the Restoration, so Cromwell, Bradshaw, they were dug up and executed publicly, and their corpses were hung, drawn, and quartered. And again, a gruesome act, but again, symbolic. It's almost as if, right, so what do we do here? Do we have mass slaughter of all of the opponents? Do we dig a few bodies up to symbolically say these are dead, but they're not going to get away with it? And all of the others that signed the warrant aren't. Not everybody that signed the warrant did die. There were some that made peace or evaded authorities.
Two of whom Robert Harris has written about.
That's right, yeah.
Great stuff. Okay, so just before we finish then, let's just talk a little bit about the legacy of the execution of Charles I, because, I mean, the French, it took them another 100 years to execute their king. Is it a sign of progress for a European country to chop the head off of the king?
I think it was a sign that England had perhaps moved beyond, moved on and was looking for a different approach to government, a different balance of government, willing to try new things. So yeah, I think it was ahead of its time. Some of the levelers' demands, even though they weren't all implemented, a few of them did get implemented, but perhaps it did pave the way for it either, depending on how you look at it, it could have reduced another bloody conflict, a prolonged or an even longer conflict, and just sobered people up to think, well, actually, we've seen the Civil War. We don't want another. We all understand that we've lost people and that it was a bloody time. Let's see if we can see out our differences in other ways than bloodshed. And perhaps it did give the Hanoverians that respite from another revolution at the time of the French Revolution.
Thank you very, very much. It's been a real education and a treat, and it's actually quite much of it is very moving. And it's Charles. I think we've mentioned this a few times. It really is Charles I, who I don't think by any stretch one could describe him as a huge success as a king, but I think his trial and his execution did show that he had some good sides to him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing that I've found in research and biography of him, that he is so two-dimensional. It's unbelievable. He wasn't a murderer and he's not a martyr. Well, he could say he was a martyr, but he certainly, it's not as simple as that. He's not guilty of murder and he's not absolutely innocent. Was he a good king? I think on the one hand, you could say that he was a bad king because he ended up losing his head, that he presided over a civil war. But I think it's more complex than that. I think would that war have been unavoidable? Would it have come at any rate, regardless of who was there? But Charles, I do feel that leading opponents had become sick of the status quo at James the Sixth and First's death. And whoever took over at that point had to do something different. And the fact that Charles was a continuation of that government, that regime, the traditions, the beliefs, people weren't willing to go for another lifetime without challenging that. So the question is, if Henry or Elizabeth had succeeded, would they have given up prerogative power freely, or would they have made a stand against it? How would they have dealt with finances? All of these problems they would have had to deal with, which Charles tried. So it makes it tricky to say, was he a good or a bad king? Ultimately bad if you say that it took us to civil war. But I think there's a lot of deeper questions that we can ask. What were his motives? Was he, because he was an idealist, did he have genuinely good motives? Was he too good? I'll tell you an interesting point, Ollie. So we visited the Tower of London. And in the gift shop, there was some chocolates. I'm not sure if you've seen them because they've been around a while. I think they've got 6 monarchs and famous paintings on the back of the chocolates. They've got a bit of information about them. And there's Charles I, Charles II, Victoria, Elizabeth I, Henry VIII. And out of interest, I thought, right, let's take Henry VIII and Charles I. Let's have a look and see what's actually written on the back, about them. And typically it says Charles had no time for parliaments, was executed by his people. And that's the failure king coming in. But for Henry, it's said that he was a complete Renaissance prince. Yes, could be cruel and brutal, for example, his wives and ministers, however, and putting down rebellions. However, his rule was effective. Now, the thing is here, if Charles had been as ruthless as Henry, would we say Charles is a failed king, or would he be a true Renaissance prince? If Henry wasn't ruthless and he was more like Charles, and he didn't execute some of the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace, the rebellion in his reign, would we say that he was a failed king? You know what I mean? Very easy to sort of swap the roles around, isn't it?
It sounds like the Henry VIII Society has been writing the chocolate at the back of the. Mark, it's a good way to end it, posing that question, and as you say, I completely appreciate that things are often a lot more complicated and nuanced than just whether he was a good or a bad king. But it's been fascinating to hear all about it. And thank you.
Thanks. So I know it's been fascinating talking about it. Thanks for having us on the podcast again. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening. On Saturday, I welcome back Saul David to talk about his great book Zulu, all on the Zulu War. Plenty more great chats to come, so please do subscribe and rate and review if you can. And in the meantime, Thank you and good night.